All right, so today we're going to be tackling a topic that I'm sure everyone has at least some opinion on.
Oh, yeah.
Donald Trump.
Definitely a conversation starter.
Yeah, whether you love him or you hate him, he was president for 4 years and
He definitely left his mark.
yeah, and he's still in the news all the time. So
That's for sure.
we're going to be asking the age-old question, is he a genius
Ooh.
or a madman?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it?
Exactly.
Genius or madman?
And we're going to try to figure that out today.
We'll see if we can come up with a definitive answer.
Let's see if we get anywhere close.
But at least we'll have fun trying, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the source material that we're using to kind of frame this conversation is really interesting. It's from a podcast called It's an Open Secret.
Catchy title.
Yeah, it is. And the hosts, Molly and Duncan,
Okay.
they're kind of going back and forth
Debating.
on this question, is he a genius or a madman?
It's a good framework for a conversation.
Yeah.
You can really dive into those two extremes and see where the truth lies somewhere in between.
Right. And it's interesting because they both bring up some pretty compelling points.
For both sides.
Yeah.
I mean, I found myself kind of nodding along
Oh, yeah, me too.
to both of them at different times.
Absolutely. So I'm really curious to see where this conversation takes us.
Yeah, me too. Let's dive in.
All right, so first up, Duncan makes this point about Trump's ability to connect with voters who felt completely ignored by the political establishment. He calls it strategy in his madness,
Oh, interesting.
like suggesting that Trump's seemingly chaotic style was actually a way to tap into a very specific base.
Right. And what's fascinating there is that he's not just talking about traditional Republican voters.
Right.
He's talking about people who felt disillusioned by both parties, folks who felt like the system wasn't working for them.
Yeah.
Like, think about the Rust Belt voters who swung the 2016 election.
Right.
Many of them voted Democrat in the past,
Yeah.
but they were drawn to Trump's message, his message of economic populism and his willingness to challenge the status quo.
Right. It was like he gave a voice to this simmering anger and frustration that
Definitely.
no one else was really addressing.
Exactly. And that's a powerful thing
Yeah.
to tap into that kind of raw emotion.
But then Molly pushes back on this.
Okay.
She's like, is this really insight or just manipulation?
Ooh, good point.
And she brings up this report from the Regrettable Institute.
Never heard of that one.
Yeah, it's kind of a think tank.
Okay.
And they analyzed political rhetoric, and they found that Trump's rhetoric often relied on sowing division and fear
Interesting.
rather than offering real solutions.
So is he a genius for recognizing this discontent?
Right.
Or is he just exploiting it
Exactly.
for his own gain?
It's a really tough question.
It really makes you think about the ethics of leadership, right?
Yeah,
Like, when is it okay to tap into those kinds of emotions?
right. Where do you draw the line?
Yeah, is it ever okay?
And then they get into this whole honesty versus recklessness debate.
Okay, how does that one go?
So Duncan praises Trump for his honesty.
His honesty.
Yeah, he says it's refreshing.
Interesting.
He actually uses Trump's downplaying of the pandemic as an example,
Oh, wow.
saying that it resonated with people who were tired of feeling like they were being talked down to.
So it's like this idea that he's not sugarcoating things.
Right.
He's just telling it like it is.
Yeah, even if it's not what people want to hear.
Right, and that can be appealing to some people.
Exactly,
Well,
like he's not playing the game.
yeah, the anti-politician.
But Molly sees this as dangerous recklessness, not honesty.
Okay, I can see that side of it too.
Yeah, she points to all the news reports at the time
Right.
about how the Trump administration mishandled resources and downplayed the severity of the pandemic.
Potentially costing lives.
Right, and that's where you get into the heart of the genius or madman question.
Right.
On one hand, you have this bold, unconventional leader who isn't afraid to shake things up. But on the other hand,
You have the potential consequences of those actions.
yeah,
The real-world impact on people's lives.
it's a tough balance.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's not always clear cut.
Okay, so then they move on to risk-taking,
Okay.
which Duncan frames as a positive.
Okay, so he's all for it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's like, Trump's willing to make the tough calls, the ones other politicians shy away from.
Interesting.
And he even compares Trump to Obama, highlighting the healthcare rollout as an example of mismanagement that can happen in any administration.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. It's like even well-intentioned leaders can make mistakes.
Sure, governing is messy.
Yeah,
Totally.
it's not easy.
But Molly's point is that Trump's risk-taking often came at the expense of vulnerable populations.
Okay, so she's saying there's a difference between making a mistake
Right.
and intentionally putting people at risk.
Exactly. And she specifically cites his environmental policy rollbacks
Okay.
and how they disproportionately affected marginalized communities.
I remember reading about that in the Washington Post.
Yeah, they did a whole series on it.
Yeah, it was pretty eye-opening.
She's like, is prioritizing the economy over the planet truly a sign of genius?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Right, because if we measure success purely by economic indicators,
Right.
then maybe Trump's approach could be seen as strategic.
Sure.
But if we factor in the long-term impact on the environment and the well-being of these communities,
Right. The bigger picture.
it gets a lot more complicated.
It definitely does.
Okay, so next, Duncan tries to draw a parallel between Trump and another famous figure, Steve Jobs.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's an interesting comparison.
Right? He says they were both visionaries, both difficult personalities, but ultimately they changed the world.
I mean, I can see where he's coming from.
Right.
Like, both of them were disruptors,
Totally.
and they weren't afraid to challenge the status quo.
Right, and they both had huge successes.
Yeah. But they also alienated a lot of people along the way.
Oh, for sure.
But Molly immediately pushes back on that comparison.
Yeah, she's like, Steve Jobs never incited violence or spread misinformation like Trump did.
Right. There's a big difference between being a demanding boss
Right.
and encouraging violence.
And she even brings up examples of Trump's rhetoric inspiring extremist groups.
Yeah, that's pretty scary.
It's chilling.
It makes you wonder, where do you draw the line between being a disruptor
Yeah.
and being a danger to society?
Right, because challenging the status quo is one thing,
Right.
but undermining democracy is a whole other level.
Exactly.
And then to bring in some historical context, Duncan compares Trump to Reagan,
Oh, okay.
arguing that Reagan also energized his base through divisive rhetoric.
That's true.
Yeah, and he suggests that maybe history will look back on Trump more favorably.
Oh, interesting.
It's like maybe with time we'll forget the bad stuff.
And just remember the things that he accomplished.
Right, or maybe we'll reinterpret them.
It happens all the time with historical figures.
Yeah, we kind of rewrite history to fit our current narrative.
Exactly.
But Molly makes a good point.
What's that?
She says, just because a leader is effective doesn't automatically mean that they were good for society.
Oh, that's a really important point.
Right.
We can't just look at results.
Exactly.
We have to consider the methods.
And the long-term impact.
Yeah.
Like, what kind of legacy did they leave behind?
Absolutely.
Okay, so now we get to what Duncan sees as one of Trump's greatest strengths.
I'm curious.
His ability to tap into voter frustration.
Yeah, okay.
He specifically mentions things like trade and foreign policy,
Yeah.
areas where he felt traditional politicians had failed to address the concerns of everyday Americans.
So he's saying Trump understood those voters
Yeah, like on a deeper level.
and was able to speak to their frustrations.
Right, and that's where Molly brings up the word exploitation.
Ooh, okay.
She sees Trump's approach to issues like immigration as a prime example.
Okay.
She argues that he didn't just address these issues,
Yeah.
he actively fueled fear and resentment around them.
For political gain.
Exactly.
So it's about intent, right?
Yeah, was he genuinely trying to address these issues?
Or was he just using them?
To manipulate voters.
It's a tough one to answer,
Right.
but it's something we have to think about when we're assessing leadership.
Absolutely. And then things get really intense when they start talking about January 6th.
Yeah, yeah, that's a big one.
The insurrection.
Right.
Duncan tries to frame it as a reflection of the deep frustrations within the electorate.
Okay, so he's saying it was bound to happen.
Kinda. Yeah.
Like all that anger and frustration had to boil over somehow,
Right. And he sees Trump as a symptom of that.
but not necessarily the cause.
Right.
Interesting take.
But Molly's argument is that the insurrection was a direct result of Trump's lies and rhetoric.
Okay, so she's putting the blame squarely on him.
Yeah, she says he spent years undermining democratic norms and fueling distrust in the system.
Right, and then that all culminated in January 6th.
And she even brings up an article from The Atlantic that talked about the erosion of democratic norms under Trump.
Right, and how that damage goes beyond just that one event.
Exactly. It's like a long-term trend.
And a scary one,
Yeah, for sure.
because it makes you wonder what's next,
Right, like where do we go from here if we can't even agree on basics facts?
or on the rules of the game.
Exactly, and that's something that Molly and Duncan really grapple with in the rest of their discussion.
Okay, well, I'm definitely interested in hearing more about that.
Yeah, me too.
So let's take a quick break,
Okay.
and then we'll come back and unpack the rest of this conversation.
Sounds good.
Welcome back. So we're continuing our deep dive into the question, is Donald Trump a genius or a madman?
Right, and in part one, we really got into it with Molly and Duncan's debate from It's an Open Secret.
Yeah, they didn't hold back.
Not at all. They covered so much ground. From Trump's connection with voters to the concerns about his impact on democracy.
Yeah, I mean, this conversation really goes beyond just Trump himself.
Totally.
It makes you think about leadership,
Yeah.
What it means to be a leader in a world that feels so divided.
Right. Like, what do we value in a leader?
Exactly.
Is it just about winning?
Or is it about something more?
Like integrity or honesty?
Right. Those things matter too.
And that's something that Molly and Duncan really get into in this next part of the conversation.
Okay, so where do they go from there?
Well, they start talking about the fact that Trump lied a lot.
Yeah.
Constantly.
We all know that.
Right.
But they actually cite the Washington Post,
Okay.
which documented over 30,000 false or misleading claims
30,000.
during his presidency.
Wow. That's a lot.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, and for Molly, it's not just the lies themselves. It's the GOP's willingness to go along with it.
Right.
Like, how can an entire political party just abandon truth?
Yeah, I mean, is it just about power at that point?
That's what she's worried about.
Yeah, I can see why she'd be concerned.
But Duncan tries to make the case that the GOP might be making a calculated decision.
Okay.
Like, maybe they think that aligning with Trump, even if it means accepting the lies, will keep them in power.
So they can achieve their goals.
Exactly.
It's a risky strategy,
Oh, totally.
but it might make sense from a purely political perspective.
But Molly argues that it's dangerous, like in the long run.
Because it erodes trust.
Yeah.
And trust is essential for a functioning democracy.
And Duncan then suggests that maybe the GOP is banking on a total shift in the American electorate.
Oh, wow.
Like they're playing the long game, even if it means bending the rules now.
Interesting.
But Molly questions whether a movement built on deception can ever be truly sustainable.
Right, like eventually people will catch on.
Yeah.
And the whole thing could crumble.
And that's where the media comes into play.
Oh, yeah.
Because Duncan points out that we're bombarded with information from all sides these days.
So much information.
It's overwhelming.
And it's hard to know what to believe.
Exactly.
Like we're all living in our own filter bubbles.
Yeah. And that makes it easier for politicians to manipulate us.
Especially when they're willing to exploit our biases.
Right. Like they know what buttons to push.
And they know how to get our attention.
And Molly agrees that navigating the media landscape is tough. But she sees the GOP's embrace of Trump's falsehoods as a deliberate strategy.
Okay, so they're not just trying to survive in this new media world.
Right.
They're actively trying to shape it to
Exactly.
their advantage.
So are we any closer to answering the question, genius or madman?
While Molly seems to be leaning towards Madman,
Okay.
she points to the lies, the divisive rhetoric, the disregard for democratic norms.
Right.
But Duncan is more nuanced.
Like always.
He sees Trump as a savvy political player
Okay.
who knows how to connect with people on an emotional level.
Even if it means bending the truth.
Right, and that's what makes this whole thing so complicated.
Yeah.
Because it forces us to acknowledge that a leader can be both effective and deeply flawed.
Like you can be successful even if you do bad things.
Exactly.
And that's a really unsettling thought.
It definitely is.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the question. Donald Trump genius or madman?
Yeah, it's been a wild ride.
It really has. And in this last part of their conversation, Molly and Duncan start to look ahead
Okay,
to the future.
so they're thinking about the legacy of the Trump era
Exactly.
and what it means for the country moving forward.
And Molly's pretty worried about the Republican Party.
What are her concerns?
Well, she thinks that their embrace of Trump and his tactics
Right.
has really damaged their credibility.
In the long term.
Yeah.
Because it's like they've abandoned their principles.
Right, and she even uses the word authoritarian
Oh, wow.
to describe the direction they're headed.
So she's worried about the future of democracy.
Yeah, she sees this as a real threat.
It's a scary thought.
It is.
But Duncan, as always, offers a different perspective.
Right.
He's more optimistic
Yeah, he thinks that the GOP is just adapting.
to a changing world.
Like they're trying to stay relevant
Exactly.
in a political landscape that's shifting under their feet.
And he points out that political parties have a history of reinventing themselves.
That's
Like, the Democratic Party today is very different from the Democratic Party of the 1950s.
right. They've evolved.
Yeah. So maybe the GOP's embrace of Trumpism is just another example of that kind of evolution.
But Molly's not convinced.
Okay.
She thinks that this particular evolution could be really dangerous.
Because it's based on lies and division
Right, and she worries that it will ultimately alienate moderate voters.
and just make the country even more divided.
Yeah, it's like they're digging themselves into a deeper and deeper hole.
And it's hard to see how they climb out of it.
Right, so what does all of this mean for the future?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it?
Like, what kind of country do we want to live in?
Do we want a country where winning is everything?
Even if it means sacrificing our values?
Or do we want a country where truth and integrity still matter?
Right. Those are some big questions.
Yeah, and I don't think there are any easy answers.
But at least we're having the conversation.
That's the first step.
And I think that's what Molly and Duncan are trying to do.
To get people thinking
To get people talking.
about the kind of future we want to create.
So after all this back and forth, are we any closer to figuring out if Trump is a genius or a madman?
Honestly, I don't know.
Me neither.
But maybe that's not the point.
All right.
Maybe the point is to just keep asking questions.
To keep exploring.
To keep challenging our assumptions.
Because that's how we learn.
And that's how we grow.
So that's our deep dive into the enigma of Donald Trump.
It's been a fascinating journey.
It really has.
And I think we've all learned a lot along the way.
I know I have.
So thanks for joining us.
And we'll see you next time for another deep dive.